think the first thing that I want to raise is probably the thing that's most urgent on Israeli minds, and I think this may have even come up in one of our sessions, and that is what our current Knesset is immediately focused on. Going back to the foundation of the state, we have a basic law that instructs us regarding the Knesset as the representative legislative institution, Clause 36A, stating that if the state budget bill has not been passed within 3 months of the beginning of the fiscal year, the day following the conclusion of the above period shall be considered as if the Knesset had decided to dissolve itself before the end of its term, and early elections shall be had on the last Tuesday before the end of 90 days, before blah, 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 blah. Meaning that the current Knesset must pass its national budget by March 31st. And in a way, we're close, because already back in December, we passed what's called the first reading of the law. Typically, all Israeli laws must pass 3 readings. The first one is the most crucial because that's the one that kind of gets the law moving. There's sort of a blueprint for a law. It then goes back to committee, and then usually once it comes out of the committee, it passes the second round and the third round successively, almost at the same time, and then becomes a law. So we've already gotten the budget through the first round, which is a big move. The problem is not so much the budget, but the parties that, and this happens every time, right? It happens in America too. The parties that are then going to hold the budget hostage in order to then change some other maybe legislative priorities. As you might remember, we looked at this. It might have been actually back in the fall, so some of you may not remember this. I can't remember when we last looked at this. But our current Knesset has a majority of, at least on paper, 62 out of 120, right? That's not a big majority, kind of like the United States House at the moment. It's a very, very, very slim majority. There is a little bit of play because you might remember last month, Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power, pulled out of the coalition. Although not all of their members of Knesset were happy about that, so there's at least one guy who's still sort of pretending to be part of the coalition. And they have promised, to a certain extent, to be supportive of the governing coalition from the outside. So that's a little bit of a buffer zone. However, United Torah Judaism, right, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox party, is now threatening from within the coalition to topple this government if it doesn't get its demands. So this is the sort of the domestic issue that I wanted to share with you because it's a very powerful one, some of which I assume you're already familiar with. So most of the kind of the conversation around this very tense moment where the government has less than a month now to pass the national budget, or we have no government and we'd immediately go to elections. By the way, if that happens, we would go to elections, I think it would be June 24th. So there is...
fiscal year starts January 1st?
Sorry?
The Israeli fiscal year starts on January
Yes.
1st.
Yeah. And so, as always, right, we have a lot of history to our political challenges. So I wanted to share this text with you because it's quite fabulous how this kind of plays into a very modern domestic issue. So here we are back in the Talmud, right? This is from Tractate Shabbat. And it's a very interesting story that you may or may not make the immediate connection. We learn in the Mishnah that if one began any one of the activities mentioned in the Mishnah, it's a whole list of activities earlier on that I didn't cover, like sitting in a barber's chair, like all kinds of random things. One need not stop to recite the Amidah prayer. However, one stops to recite the Shema. Okay? Basically meaning like we sort of rank our Jewish activities, and there are certain things that you stop your kind of mundane world in order to do, and some things that you just keep doing, your mundane things, and then you can get to the Amidah later. As it was taught, Torah scholars who are engaged in the study of Torah stop their Torah study for the Shema, but do not stop for prayer. Rabbi Yochanan said they only taught that they need not stop for prayer with regard to the likes of Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai and his colleagues whose Torah is their vocation and they never interrupt their Torah study. However, for the likes of us, meaning the rest of the world, who also engage in other activities, we stop for the Shema and for prayer. how is this relevant to the current budget crisis? These two words, right? These words right here, Torah, vocation. Torah, vocation in Hebrew, Toratan, Omunatan. The Torah is their vocation, meaning they are perhaps seen as, the top of the food chain in sort of a Jewish world. The Torah is everything to them. They have to keep studying Torah because they are maybe the legal decisors for the community, right? They're giving guidance. They're running sort of the Jewish show. And so perhaps they should be given an exemption from any other thing that's going on in the world simply because they need to keep studying Torah. How is this relevant? Because, as many of you might be familiar, right, one of the kind of struggles that has existed since 1948, since the establishment of the State of Israel, is that the ultra-Orthodox community writ large has campaigned that because of this Jewish tradition, young ultra-Orthodox men perhaps should not or don't serve in the Israeli military. Now, in 1948, when this exemption, for this reason, right, meaning the Talmud was quoted, it still is quoted in the Israeli kind of, it's not a law, but it's an exemption to the law. When this happened in 1948, it was regarding 400 young men, right? Now, any military can tell you that plus or minus 400 is probably not going to make all the difference in the world. Not only that, but not to build on stereotypes, but those 400 men weren't exactly the guys that the government wanted on the front lines, right? Struggling in that particular war. That doesn't mean they didn't have the capabilities. It just means that sort of wasn't, that wasn't their thing. Over the years, this has obviously ballooned. This has become a major issue. The ultra-Orthodox community has grown tremendously. You might recall this graph that we looked at once before. They are now just over 11% of the Jewish community. Right, meaning they're growing in numbers largely because of the very high birth rate. The birth rate is roughly 7.2 in the ultra-Orthodox community. And so as of this year, there are somewhere between 50 to 60,000 young ultra-Orthodox men of military conscription age who are not serving in the military.
Wow.
That makes a tremendous difference, especially in a time of war. Right? We also have tens of thousands of not so young men anymore who have been torn away from their families, their businesses, their communities in order to do reserve duty, right? Over the last year and a half of war. And one, as you might imagine, right, one of the sort of sticking points is, would those people have had to do as much reserve duty, had to risk their lives? Many of them lost their lives in the current war, if the entirety of the Jewish community was equally shouldering a burden such as military service, right? That is a question that often gets asked within Israeli society. So not surprising that there's a tremendous amount of anger and frustration and tension between these two worlds. Obviously, from an ultra-Orthodox point of view, right, there is a deep, deep connection to Jewish learning and the role that plays in Jewish sustainability. Now, not every ultra-Orthodox person believes this, but certainly you will hear it coming from the leaders of the community, the rabbis, the politicians, when they talk about the fact that studying Torah is exactly what God wants from us. And so it is not the Israeli military that is defending and protecting the people of Israel. It is the yeshiva bachers who are studying Torah full time, and that is why they need an exemption, because without that, God will get angry, the Jews will be punished, and we will lose wars. Whether or not they fully believe that 100% in their heart, I don't know, but it is a very, very common sentiment among many of the leadership. That doesn't mean, of course, that there are ultra-Orthodox men who don't sort of think, well, maybe I should go, right? We have ultra-Orthodox units within the Israeli military. There are thousands of young ultra-Orthodox men who are participating in that shouldering of the national burden. The IDF has gone way out of its way to accommodate ultra-Orthodox young men by having specific units that have specific kashrut, because they will do things differently than the rest of the army, even though the entirety of the army is kosher. They will do Shabbat differently. There are units where there are no women allowed at all. Not educators, not administrators, nothing. No women present at all, just so they can serve. And so there's sort of a feeling like the IDF is doing what it can to accommodate, but yet still the ultra-Orthodox leadership, in this case mostly the Ashkenazi leadership, the ultra-Orthodox Shas party, representing the Sephardi world and the Mizrahi world, have been a little bit more flexible, especially right now, given that it's a time of war. There's a lot of sort of craziness going on. But certainly within the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi world, the leadership has really been doubling down on this demand that this exemption continue. If you pay attention to the news, you will know that in June of last year, after many, many, many years of the Supreme Court saying this is illegal, it's not fair, it's not just that some people have to serve and some people don't have to serve within the Jewish world, in June of last year, the Supreme Court officially decided unanimously, left wing, right wing, everybody in the Supreme Court said this is essentially what you would say unconstitutional, even though technically, as you know, we don't have a constitution. And so they have been throwing it back into the legislative lap, telling the Knesset members, you have to either follow the law and conscript ultra-Orthodox Jews, or make a law, right? There is no law regarding this exemption. It has just been sort of an understanding. And so the ultra-Orthodox UTJ party is now demanding that this be made into a law so that they support the budget can pass, and the government doesn't disband, right? It's kind of this like fakakta, wacky circle, just going in a big round. As of this morning, recognizing that the Knesset doesn't seem to be able to move forward on this issue, not surprisingly, because they only represent 11% of the public, right? The other 90% are all saying very vociferously, recruit the young ultra-Orthodox men, right? We're in a time of war. We're always a military country. We need everybody to help out. And so if the government were to pass a law permanently exempting tens of thousands of young men from military service, where your kids, i.e. the non-ultra-Orthodox community, are dying, right? You can imagine that that's just not going to fly, right? The government they're never going to get forward with that. So everybody's kind of playing the game of sort of waiting and promising and this and that. So literally just this morning, Yitzhak Goldfarb, who is the head of that party, this one, the United Toward Judaism Party, said that not only is it an issue to pass this law, but now they're demanding, because that law's not moving forward, they're demanding 1 billion shekels in subsidies for the ultra-Orthodox yeshiva world in order to support the passage of the budget. And then they might agree to wait a little bit until after the budget gets passed, and then they'll pass the law exempting the ultra-Orthodox men from service.
I thought they did start conscripting them, no?
Oh, they've been conscripting them since 1948, as I said. There are thousands of young ultra-Orthodox men who serve in the army. They have special units. Some of them are integrated. And as a result of the crisis, they've been trying to up the numbers. They called up, just recently, they called up about, I think it was 3,000 young ultra-Orthodox men who were supposed to receive the exemption, right? But now that's illegal. Out of those 3,000, I think only maybe 1,500 even showed up, meaning the other 1,500 technically are meant to be arrested and put into jail, because that is what happens if you do not show up. And then out of those, right, some of them aren't fit for service, some of them, like, the process drags on. So that whole process, which was supposed to be like this big thing of, issuing call-ups to 50,000 some odd young men, out of that, I think maybe there were a few hundred that actually ended up in the service. So it hasn't been, the Army claims obviously it's doing the best that it can. It's a concerted effort to be able to sort of make that happen, but it's not going well. And as a result of all of this conversation, we may not have a budget by the end of the month, and therefore we may not have a government. So you can see how this is a pretty big domestic issue. Yeah.
Just a quick question on that slide. If I go to vote as an Israeli, do I get a ballot with, I'm counting about 12 different parties, or do I?
No, you get a ballot with about 40 different parties. Most of the parties don't make it into the Knesset. Yeah, we did a whole session, you may not have been here, but so it's not your fault, but we did a whole session on the Knesset itself and talked about how the political system works. So yeah, the choice is even much harder than you would have imagined. Because most of those parties, there's a threshold of 3.5%. So if you don't get a certain number of votes, then you don't even get to play the game. But you at least get a ballot. And so, yeah. So it's a difficult choice. These are all the ones who pass the threshold in one way or another. As I said, there are lots of games that get played in the coalition building process. But it's a very, very thin margin of leadership. And therefore, every vote counts. So if UTJ is going to cause trouble or pull out, then it's possible the government might fall and we might have new elections. And right now, and then Richard, I'll get to you, if we are paying attention to any of the recent surveys, it seems pretty clear that while Netanyahu's sort of public support is definitely on the rise, it's not nearly what it would have been or was, right, in recent years, meaning there's a good chance that Likud may not even be able to form the next coalition. And that somebody like Naftali Bennett, or maybe, I don't know, even like a rebel, somebody in the Likud, or somebody in that sort of the universe of the coalition, might actually be able to reconstruct, right, what the next Israeli government looks like.
I just have to give you a soldier's perspective. I was a senior pilot for the Air Force.
Okay, in which army?
In the United States Air Force.
Oh, okay.
And I've flown on combat missions, and I was dependent on my crew. My life literally depended on my crew,
Right.
fellow crews in the air, and everybody else. I wanted to be with people that wanted to be there.
Right.
And people and other soldiers don't really want to be there, and you have doubts and everything else. Your military folds up.
Right.
It literally folds up. So if you
So
can constrict them,
you raise a
and-
good issue.
And then and you can't depend upon them. Yeah. There's a lot of Orthodox that actually volunteer and join and come in. They want to be there.
Right, well, so you
But
have,
to have ones that do not want to be there, it will remind me of the Vietnam era, and I'm a Vietnam veteran.
right.
And that's the worst thing in the world. So I've got to give you that.
So
story.
you raise an issue. So first of all, so there's two sides to the coin. First of all, there are many, many, many religious Jewish Israelis who live an Orthodox life and serve in the military. I don't know if anybody saw, but about a month and a half, maybe 2 months ago, the head of the national sort of religious kind of sector within the political realm, Bezalel Smotrich, who's our finance minister, gave a very, very tearful speech about all of the religious community and how they have sacrificed their children, right, in the war, because there's a very, very high number of religious young men who are not ultra-Orthodox, but who are Orthodox, who do serve in the military, and they have very high sort of rates of commitment and, desire. So that's one thing, not to sort of blanket like the religious community, because obviously some are very committed to service and others are not. Not only that, but it's also important to say that in the rest of the country, where people might not identify as religious or identify as religious a little bit differently, there are also thousands of young men and women who are serving, who don't have their heart in the game, right? That's part of the nature of mandatory conscription, is that, we could say, well, we don't really want the ultra-Orthodox because they're not really committed. They're not going to be good soldiers. We could actually say that about thousands of non-religious soldiers as well, because they have to be there. Luckily, the IDF has a very serious process that takes usually well over a year and a half, for each new recruit to figure out, where do they belong? What's your commitment level? What are you good for? What are you not good for? So hopefully that would be weeded out through the process itself. But there's another element to this, and that is, why do you have to do military service? Even in a time of war, Israel did not call up every person who qualifies for reserve duty. Meaning, we don't necessarily need every single human in the country to be in the military at the same time. Are there other ways that you can do national service to give back to your country? So maybe all the ultra-Orthodox could do what many of you know my daughter did. She looked at the options in the military. She thought they sucked, didn't want to do those. So instead, as a young religious woman, she had the option of doing civic service. And so she spent 3 years as a teacher in the deaf community and had an amazing time. She gave 3 years of her life to her country. She didn't get paid, right? And that was considered part of national service. So why couldn't the ultra-Orthodox all work in ultra-Orthodox kindergartens, right? It would maybe then relieve other people who are working in those jobs, and those people could go and serve in the military if they were, up for it and ready and able, et cetera, et cetera. Meaning, there's a lot of creative ways around this. Doesn't necessarily have to be a military solution. And maybe even more importantly, many people would argue that if we're able to offer a broader perspective on what national service and the national burden means, that would then also invite more of the non-Jews into the conversation. We have many, many, many non-Jews who serve in the military, many who also serve in some form of civic service, but most of the non-Jews of Israel don't do any service at all because they're not legally required to. But what does that say for the fabric of society, right? In terms of othering, one community or another, not feeling like you're all playing the same game or you're all sort of really even part of the same nation. But if we were all able to do some sort of service, that might actually solve a lot of different problems. Who knows?
But it seems to me, though, that you're still pulling them away from the vocation, right?
And that is their
just
claim.
means you're presuming it's just that they don't want to fight.
Right.
When in fact it may be that they want to study.
Right.
And so whether you offer them, Peace Corps or whatever,
Right.
they still don't want to do that.
Right.
So I'm not sure that that's a solution.
You're right, it may not be. So one solution that has come up specifically in response to that is that maybe there should be an exemption for a certain number of elite students who really are like that is their craft, right? Torah is their craft, and they will become great leaders for their community through that. So you offer a certain number of exemptions. I don't think anybody in the world would have a problem with that if it was very well defined. However, you then have to respond to the greater population of Israel that is not ultra-Orthodox and say, why don't some of the elite students in this world also get exemptions to go get, to stay on course with your PhD or, to whatever you're doing, right? Meaning if you're going to offer military exemptions here, you're right. But I think that would be relatively easy to sort of pass as legislation.
Yeah.
If they get what they want and everybody over here gets what they want, but it's limited to the scope that still enables the nation to sustain itself through military service and civil service. So that's a very relevant question that you ask, and a response that's already been discussed. Unfortunately, we seem to get stuck in this very sort of black and white conversation, right? Of ultra-Orthodox men must serve in the military, they refuse because they're studying Torah, right? So we often we seem to struggle to broaden that conversation to include non-military service, maybe some exemptions, but some not. And that's exactly what's happening in the news right now. And everybody's panicking because the days are counting down and we may not have a government, and that could be, some people might be really happy if you don't like the current government. You've seen the protests on the street. At least half of Israel is not happy with the current government. They would be very happy for it to fall. So it wouldn't surprise me if you have a bunch of secular Israelis in Tel Aviv who are sort of cheering on Goldknopf, saying, yeah, back out of the government, go ultra-Orthodox, because then maybe we get a chance to have a new government.
If the government falls,
Yeah.
what are the implications regarding Netanyahu's legal issues?
So that was one of the other issues that I was going to raise. I was actually saving it for later, but I'll mention it now. I don't have a lot to say on it because there's really not that much happening right now. Certainly, I would say most Israelis, whether knowledgeable or otherwise, assume that Netanyahu's political decisions are at least influenced by, if not completely clouded by, his own personal challenges right now. The fact that he is standing trial in 3 different corruption, breach of trust, etc. trials. He has, as many of you have probably seen on the news, he has started to take the witness stand. So he is already deeply involved in a personal way in his trial, currently 3 times a week. They're trying to negotiate it back down to 2 times a week. Based on the strategy of the trial, it looks like Netanyahu's testimony is going to go at least another year, right? This has been a process already going for, I think it's been 4 years now. And there's probably a strategy of drawing it out, right? That's not unheard of, certainly not in the legal world. But a lot of folks assume that he is guilty on at least one of the many charges, because there are so many, and they're quite serious. But he is determined, as is his legal staff, to address every single accusation and to show how it's all, sort of a witch hunt, a political witch hunt. I can't imagine you're familiar with that term. No country has political witch hunts. So it is quite possible that many of these charges won't stick. Netanyahu and Trump seem to have sort of similar success rates in having multiple accusations, multiple court cases, and never really, getting in trouble for anything. Maybe that's because they're innocent. Maybe that's because the justice system is flawed. I'm not going to comment on that, just to say that clearly these issues are interlinked, right? Netanyahu has been so actively trying to court UTJ and deal with their issues, and maybe that's why he has made these promises to fund the yeshivas to this extreme amount, because he knows that if the government falls, there's a good chance he will not be prime minister, and therefore the only thing on his plate will be going to trial. And not only that, but we have to tie in the other domestic issue, which is that we still, after a year and a half of war, have not had a formal government commission of inquiry into what happened during the war. You might have heard last week the IDF formally issued its report. It was embarrassing, to say the least, but the IDF saying that it royally fucked up everything was quite revealing. Right? Meaning we now know, we've always known, but now it's official in print. All the intelligence was there, right? Somebody in different positions knew exactly what Hamas was doing. The message was either not getting up to the top brass, or it was getting up and not being fully believed. There were all these different scenarios that were being considered. Unfortunately, only the scenarios that were acted on were the ones that were incorrect. And then there was the crisis of actually how they responded when the war broke out, and that, of course, was a complete failure. It took 24 hours for the army to even realize that there were certain communities under attack. I don't want to go into that because that's not the domestic issue I wanted to talk about. However, Israelis are used to having crises, right, like most countries, but we're also used to immediately appointing a government commission of inquiry, which is nonpartisan, meaning it's formed by the government, but it usually is headed by a former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, with lots of respected individuals involved in the process of investigating and publishing. And the current government of Israel, for very obvious political reasons, has said we do not trust that process, right? And so they have refused to put together a commission, which means that after Netanyahu is gone, more than likely that commission will be up and running, and obviously it's going to blame Netanyahu's government because they were the ones sitting in power when it happened, right? This then brings up another domestic issue, in that the reason why there's no trust between Netanyahu's administration and the potential Supreme Court justice who might head up a commission of inquiry is because, as you know, the relationship between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches is deteriorated and almost non-existent, right? Just a few weeks ago, we appointed a new president of the Israeli Supreme Court after a year of not having one, because the Minister of Justice in Netanyahu's administration refused to appoint a president of the Supreme Court, because the tradition has always been that the president is determined by seniority, and it just so happens that the next guy in line is sort of known for being one of the more liberal justices. So the minister said, no, I don't want him in charge because he's liberal and I'm not. And so, unlike any precedent ever before in Israel, we didn't have a president of the Supreme Court, which slowed down the process. The committee for appointing justices to the Supreme Court was never allowed to meet because it didn't have a president, which means we're short justices. Not only in the Supreme Court, but in all three courts in Israel, right? Remember, we did that session where we have the magistrates' courts and district courts. So we are so behind in the justice system because of this tension between the government and the judiciary branch. And in the ceremony that took place just last week or 2 weeks ago, for the first time ever, the Prime Minister of the State of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Justice Minister, Yariv Levin, didn't show up. They didn't even acknowledge that the president of the state of Israel was sort of formally anointing Amit as the president of the Supreme Court of Israel. So, I mean, it almost feels like a toddler's game. Obviously, everybody has their political reasons, but nonetheless, it was roundly sort of condemned even by people who support the current government administration. But that is all, so it's all tied together, right? You have a rift between Netanyahu's administration and the judiciary, which then is going to affect issues of commission of inquiry, which we all know is going to blame the Netanyahu government, so he wants to stay in power to be able to prevent that from happening and not end up in trial and not get convicted. And so it's all, everything is intertwined. Yeah?
So you mentioned that a lot of people would be happy to see the government fall, but would those people be pleased with what's going to come next?
Probably not. Mostly because, I mean, nobody's really ever pleased, not in a coalition government, unless there's sort of like a miracle and somehow it's what they call a unity government, right? We've had those in the past, and they do seem to generally sort of engender a wide swath of Israeli support. The problem is that a unity government, because it bridges multiple political positions, they don't tend to last very long, right? So that could happen. I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, but it could potentially happen. I mean, the center parties are always the strongest ones. Technically, where's our little pie chart here? Right, so like Likud obviously is a very strong party. Yesh Atid is a very strong party. Both of those are technically towards the center, even though Likud seems to be drifting a little bit rightward, certainly in terms of the current makeup of the coalition. So you have enough power in the middle that there could be a centrist government that would represent, as you can see by the numbers, a much larger sector of the Israeli voting public. But again, that depends on the situation. I think you might remember, I think we had this conversation the last time we talked about politics, was that the only reason why we couldn't get a centrist government the last time around was for one simple reason, and that is the heads of so many parties simply refused to sit with Netanyahu in a government. It had even nothing to do with political issues. It was just that the animosity toward Netanyahu, who has been prime minister for most of the 30 years that I have lived in Israel, was just higher than ever before. He is known as a political mastermind, and because he plays the game so well, he has pissed off so many Israeli politicians, and they just simply said, even if it makes sense politically, I will not sit with him because I don't trust him. He won't, abide by his agreements, et cetera, et cetera. And we've seen him do that. I mean, we've watched that play out over and over and over again. So it depends. It depends if the government falls and how the elections play out. Look, it's no secret that Israel is a right-of-center society. So we're not going to end up with a left-wing government, that's for sure. But we may end up with a centrist government. We have to see. Remains to be seen. Should we move on to a different issue? I will try to end on a positive note, although, I mean, we are talking about domestic crises, obviously, so anyways. What else though? Oh, I did want to show you this interesting graph. It's a little bit dated at this point, but it kind of just gives you a sense of sort of where we in Israel are all at in terms of how we feel about certain identities and their contribution to Israeli society. So it's ranked on a scale of 1 to 4. And you can see over here, not surprisingly, that the soldiers are thought of as the sector of community that kind of contributes the most to Israeli society. After all, we're a very militaristic world in Israel. And it's just worth pointing out that the ultra-Orthodox, again, fair or unfair, this could be very biased, it could be even like slightly racist, right? It's got problems to it, but generally speaking, people, Israelis, do not feel that the ultra-Orthodox contribute a lot to general society. And that is largely because they are somewhat of an insular community, right? They have their own specific way of life, and they're very happy kind of being on the side. They obviously would feel very differently. They feel like the work that they do is essentially holding together the Jewish element of the state of Israel. But nonetheless, it's just sort of interesting to see that the only two communities, of course, that score less are two of the major non-Jewish communities in Israel, and that is obviously extremely political. We all know that Bedouin and Muslim Arabs contribute a lot in terms of taxes, in terms of civic service, economic, whatever, to Israeli society, but they are perceived as not contributing largely because most of them are not super excited about the Jewishness of the state. And they're obviously challenging that on many different levels, largely because they feel that they're getting the short end of the stick, right? If you're a non-Jew living in a Jewish state, you can probably find lots of reasons how you're getting shafted, whether it's governmental budgets and how much comes to your community, the options that you might have in terms of societal advancement, things like that. One of the other issues that I wanted to just raise really briefly, hold on one second, on that sort of line is that there was just over Shabbat, there were 2 Palestinian citizens of Israel who were killed, assassinated through criminal acts, meaning not necessarily political, certainly not related to the war, which brings the total for January and February to 50, which may not sound like a lot, except that this is now on course to beat the new record that was set last year and the year before of deaths within the Palestinian-Israeli community. And there is just an unbelievable amount of fear and frustration within that community. And they all know, again, in their minds, right? This is them speaking. They all know exactly why this is happening. And it is because the Israeli police force, by and large, avoids contact with the Arab world in Israel. Partly because most of the policemen, not all, but most of them are Jewish. And so as soon as you enter into a non-Jewish town or a region in Israel, you are maybe immediately perceived as the enemy, right? They don't necessarily trust the police. And so the police, on their part, are saying, well, we don't feel very welcome. We're a little bit nervous about getting involved. And so they kind of stay away from that. But obviously, if the police aren't around, crime is rampant. People are getting shot in the streets. And so you have the highest levels of criminally related deaths in the Arab communities in the last couple of years. And we are now on track to far surpass that number. Hopefully it won't happen. But that is also a major domestic issue because clearly it's going to affect the police. Clearly any criminal activity that happens in a non-Jewish community is not going to be limited to that community, right? Crime then expands and goes everywhere. So this has to do with gangs and mafias and all sorts of financial crimes. There's a lot that goes on that is going to eventually spill out and affect the rest of Israeli society if it's not properly dealt with. Now the police, in their defense, have been trying over the last number of years to do a lot of creative things to find ways to police the Arab communities, including increased recruitment of non-Jewish police members to serve in the force, to work in their own communities. That has been relatively successful, although it hasn't yet brought the numbers down. And not only that, but a couple of years ago, maybe a little bit more now, the government itself passed a rather surprising bill that injected many, many millions, possibly billions, I think millions, of shekels into the Palestinian world who are Israeli citizens to try specifically to deal with things like crime, but also to boost education, to boost road safety, things that have been plaguing the non-Jewish community. And we have had many governmental reports over the years that talk about how the gaps between the way the government sort of funds, subsidizes, assists Jewish communities versus non-Jewish communities is way out of whack, right? So even a right-wing, very nationalist government was able to pass a bill saying, yeah, we probably need to fix this. I mean, if anything, just for pure selfish reasons, because whatever shit happens over here is eventually going to end up in our front yard. And so there are things that are starting to happen, but that is yet another domestic issue. Certainly not top headline these days, but it's something that people are constantly hearing about, largely because of these criminal deaths that keep popping up in the newspaper, right? Almost every day you open it up, and there'll be like some young kid was caught in the crossfire in some gang warfare in like a Galilee village. And so that's a domestic issue that I would say Israelis are concerned about, that you probably don't hear a lot about in the international press. You had a question?
I wonder about Druze. They're up there.
The Druze are up there. Up there, how do you mean? Geographically up there? Oh, up there and here. Because they're also geographically up there. They're in the Galilee. Yes, so the Druze are the only non-Jewish population that essentially has mandatory conscription. It's a little bit blurry in terms of whether or not they legally would have to show up. But the Druze, part of the Druze identity is declaring loyalty to whatever nation they happen to live in, which creates some very odd moments for the Druze world, because as you might know, 99% of the Druze of the world only live in Israel and in Syria and in Lebanon. That's it. And those three countries, really, we don't have good relationships with each other, but because Druze identity sort of compels you to show loyalty, so you have Druze people who volunteer in huge numbers in the Israeli military, in the Syrian military, and in the Lebanese military. And so they are often, because of this, they are often seen as a sector that is wonderfully welcome and contributes greatly to Israeli society, because that is part of who they are. It is actually part of their religious kind of tenets to declare loyalty to whatever country they're in. That doesn't mean that they then don't have complaints about how they're treated as minorities. There have been some very serious issues in the past. Right now, things are generally going well, I would say, with the Druze community in Israel in particular. So, yeah, side issue, but nonetheless interesting to note. Yeah?
Could you define what Olim is? You have French Olim, FSU Olim.
Oh, yes. Olim literally just means immigrants, Jewish immigrants. Apologize for using the Hebrew. I couldn't fit the word immigrant, so I just used Olim because it was shorter.
And what is FSU?
FSU is former Soviet Union. Former Soviet Union. Again, apologies for the abbreviation. If there are any other words that I should explain on there, no, that's probably it.
No, that's it.
Yeah. And so, yeah, this was, I mean, again, this is a little bit out of date. It's probably about 5-6 years old now. I can't imagine things have changed that much. But nonetheless, it was sort of a very fascinating survey that was done by the JPPI, the Jewish People Institute. Jewish, I can't remember what it stands for. Anyways, yeah, so it's just kind of interesting to see how Israelis perceive these different groupings and how they kind of contribute. I don't think it really shocked anybody in particular, but nonetheless, interesting to see.
Can I just stop?
Yeah.
Reformed Jews don't seem to be well liked.
No, not at all. And that's, again, this is all perception, right? It's not because anybody understands what a Reformed Jew is. It's because reformi, right, the adjective in Hebrew, is a pejorative term. It basically means, and again, this is not a reflection of Reformed Jewry, it is how it is understood in Hebrew. When people use it on the street, what they're basically saying is that you are working from within Jewish society to take down Jewish society by changing everything, right? Meaning it's a very negative term. For that reason, the reform movement in Israel is not called reform. It's called Atnua Mitkademet, the progressive movement, because they know that the word reform is a very dirty word. So as soon as you talk about Reformed Jews, Israelis perceive that you're like, you know, it's sort of like the equivalent, I think, of like the woke thing that's happening in America, where right, people are either pro-woke or anti-woke, but whatever it is, nobody really understands what woke is. So it's the same thing. Nobody really understands the reform movement, the history, the identity, but they just know that they're sort of like the norm of what Judaism is, right? The joke is, of course, is that all the Israelis, because you remember, of course, that most of them are not religiously identified, right? The synagogue I absolutely refuse to go to on Shabbat is Orthodox. That's the joke in Israel, meaning you can be totally secular, but real Judaism is Orthodox. I don't want anything to do with it because it's dumb, but that's real Judaism. Reform Judaism with its women rabbis and its, playing instruments on Shabbat and women praying at the Western Wall, right? All they're trying to do is destroy Judaism, even though I want nothing to do with it. So that's, again, these are stereotypes. Obviously, there's lots of diversity in Israeli society, but one more and then we'll move on to somebody else.
Stereotypes. What do Israelis think of American Jews?
That's up there.
Of America, well, so you have American Olim. Where did I put them?
Diaspora Jew.
Yeah.
Oh, I guess that probably is diaspora Jew. I wonder why they didn't ask specifically about Americans. So, well, I mean, Americans have, I would say, probably a bit of a split kind of perception in Israeli society. Because on one hand, Americans are most known, please don't be offended, by your pocketbooks. It's all about the money, right? Americans are the only immigrant population that come to Israel and don't receive what we call the full basket of benefits, right? When I made Aliyah 30 years ago, I was quite surprised that I didn't get much from the government. I mean, I got some stuff, but all the other immigrants from all the other countries get lots of cool stuff to help them get sort of situated. But the assumption is Americans come with cash, so what do you need our help for? So that's one thing, is that Americans come with money and they contribute, and even if they don't come, they contribute. But the other thing is that, quite surprisingly, and I have a friend who wrote her thesis and a book about this, it is perceived that much of the leadership and the driving force behind the settler movement are American Jews. And obviously a lot of Israeli Jews have a lot of issues with the political implications of the settler movement. Ironically, the American percentage of settlers is actually quite small, but they are very, very loud. And so they're always on the media, they do have leadership positions, they are quite well known, and as a result, that has sort of split, I think, opinion on the role that the way that Americans are perceived in Israel. All right, there was a couple of hands. I still have more topics to share with you, but go ahead.
This is just, to me, a really, there's a lot behind this graph, right? Like,
Oh,
I'm
for
just
sure.
so confused about sample size and how many questions they ask to get to these perceptions. I mean, this is just a microcosm of everything that went into it. And
Isn't every survey though?
Well, yeah, but this is just so, like, thinking about, that reforms are behind Misratis, which are behind this, which are, how big is this survey? How big was the sample size? I don't
Oh, I'm
need to
sure
get
it was
into
just
specifics.
I mean, like any other survey, it's a snapshot, right? It's a moment in time, and certain people that got it, obviously, so the JPPI, I will say, is a very highly regarded institute.
Okay.
It's not a bunch of randos just walking around asking questions like, on the 5 o'clock news. It is a very serious think tank. They do very respected surveys.
Okay.
Whether or not this is one of their most respected, I don't know. But it is, I can tell you this, as an Israeli, this reflection, not off base at all, right? Obviously, it shifts, depending on who you ask, but definitely these folks are very much at the top of the scale, and these folks are not, right? That is still very true today. So I don't sort of present it as any kind of science, but just as a snapshot, just to know. Largely, I put it in there because I wanted to sort of emphasize the crisis with the ultra-Orthodox leadership, at least right now, regarding the government falling or not, because it is quite impressive the political power that they often have due to their outsized representation, right? One of the things that the ultra-Orthodox are famous for are their school networks. They have private school networks that are not fully funded by the government, largely because they refuse to implement core curriculum. But they do get money from the government, and as a result, with additional contributions and philanthropy, they offer services as part of the educational world that most Israeli schools, which is a topic we're going to get to right now, don't offer. And so there are many, many families through the school systems who become somewhat connected to the ultra-Orthodox world, even if they're not ultra-Orthodox. And as a result, as sort of a thank you, some of them actually vote ultra-Orthodox. Not only that, but as you would imagine, in a community where things are very hierarchical, right? There's almost no cynicism. If the rabbi says X, that's what you do. So when it comes time to vote, the rabbinical council says this is who we're putting forward on our slate, this is who you vote for, and everybody goes and votes.
Wow.
They have close to 90% vote rate in the ultra-Orthodox community. The rest of us in Israel hovering somewhere between 70 and 75. Lately we've been going down, I think, to the 60s, which you might know in America you're hovering around what, 40? Yeah, so it's not bad, but in the ultra-Orthodox society it is the highest. So if we could get more sort of non-ultra-Orthodox Israelis off their butts to go and vote, then there would be a little bit more of a balance. But right now, the ultra-Orthodox world right? Let me remind you, there are multiple parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism. That's 18 seats out of 120, right? That is 15% of the Knesset is ultra-Orthodox, whereas they only represent about 11% of the public by identity. And so that gives them a tremendous amount of weight. Given their identity as religious Jews more than political Jews, they have been known to be willing to swing based on political kind of wins. And so they have sat with left-wing governments, they have sat with center governments, and they are now sitting with right-wing governments. So they can often be that sort of push to get you over the edge to declare a majority coalition. And they know they have that power. And I mean, kudos to them, right? That's the whole game. You're supposed to use your power. And they are. So they're going to try to get billions of shekels for their educational institutions. They're going to try to get a law passed to exempt them from military service. And if they can get it, and it's legal, there you go. Speaking of education, let's just skip this for now. We'll come back to that. I did want to talk about education in Israel because it is, I think, a very hot topic, domestically speaking, and that is partly for these reasons, which are not exciting. We rank 33 out of 41 OECD countries. That's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is mostly the European world, in literacy, math, and science. That's surprising, no?
Has that always been the case?
I mean, aren't we Jews known for education?
Has that always been the case?
No, we've been sinking. We've been sinking,
So
yeah.
what was our top rank at one time?
I don't know that we were top ranked, but we have always been very strong. We were very strong in education. In recent years, we've been sinking. Here's another stat. We're 37 out of 41 in terms of duration of education, meaning that Israelis on average can expect to be in school for about 15 and a half years, whereas the OECD average is 18 years of education, right? Meaning folks are dropping out early, or they come from an economic community where they need to work and they can't finish school. There's lots of interesting reasons. Here's the worst one. We rank last in the OECD in terms of economic and social inequalities, meaning if you live in a wealthy community, you're going to school, everything's fine. If not, nothing, right? And so that's meaning the gap between the haves and the have-nots in terms of education is the widest of all 41 OECD countries. Average class size is 28 compared to the average of 23. The average of 28, of course, I mean, most normal schools will have many, many more than that. When my kids were in elementary school, there were 40 kids in a classroom with one teacher. Imagine the chaos. It was not fun. We have the highest percentage of youth of all the OECD countries, meaning these stats are really relevant because we have such a young population. That obviously has to do with the fact that we are very influenced by religion, between religious Jews and religious Muslims. We're starting younger and we're having a lot more kids. So education is critical. How are we going to survive if half of the population is only ranking at the bottom of the educational scale? That is a real challenge. We do rank 4th in OECD on expenditure for education, but then you wonder, wait a second, if we're spending more than most countries, where's it all going? So there seems to be a bit of a miscommunication between budgetary allocations and the success of our educational arena. So we need to rethink perhaps the way that we're spending money, and this gets talked about a lot, right? Meaning, unlike America, we don't generally ever have public conversations about spending in the government because we are still sort of operating on a socialist mindset from back in the 1940s, where we are just used to giving over to the government most of our income, right? People usually pay well over 40-50% in terms of income taxes, but we're also used to getting a lot back in return, right? We have nationalized healthcare, we have subsidized higher education, subsidized lower education before you even get to school, all kinds of great things in society that Americans often complain about and struggle about. So we're okay with giving all of our money to the government. The question is it being used effectively? And so this is obviously a statistic that worries people because we don't mind having tons of money thrown at education as long as we're not ranking last, because that's a little bit embarrassing.
I'm wondering, how much is that influenced by the money that's given to the ultra-Orthodox who don't necessarily go with the, math, science, whatever?
Yeah, not so much, because as I mentioned before, ultra-Orthodox educational institutions, not yeshivot, but the school system is budgeted only at between 50 to 75%. Meaning the government won't fully fund them because they refuse to implement core curriculum. So obviously that is going to have some effect, because those students are clearly not going to be bumping up the rankings. But nonetheless, if they are implementing the core curriculum for certain age groups, they should be testing just like everyone else is if we're doing things right. And that's really what the question is if we're throwing money at them or at any school, and we're still ranking this low, then maybe we need to take a look at our math teachers, our science teachers, like the programs, the curriculum, everything. That's really the question. I don't know that I would maybe specifically blame the ultra-Orthodox. I think in the bigger picture, it's clearly an issue that needs to be discussed. Many Israelis would like to discuss it, but I don't know that that's the sole sort of answer to this challenge.
Well, is it a partial answer to why the rank's 33rd overall?
Partially, for sure. Yes, definitely agree.
Well, that was sort of the direction I was going, and I'm wondering
Right.
if there's two Israels, because if you take, there's 10% that's ultra-Orthodox, there's
Right.
another 10% or 15% that's very religious, you have 20% that's Arab, you said those communities a lot of them are high in crime and underinvested.
Right.
So not to minimize that as an issue, but I'm wondering if you cut the country into two pieces and you took the religious, right, you took the other Israel that was invested in and with secular education, where does that rank?
So interestingly enough, they don't score as high as you would want them to sort of prove that money solves the issue, right? Meaning the haves are not necessarily scoring as high as we would want to justify, if we can just bring everybody up here. So we know that there are still flaws in the system itself, but clearly, if you look at the haves and weed out the have-nots, then yes, the scores definitely climb. But then you could make the argument that you would have to do that with all of the OECD countries in order to compare their haves with our haves.
Fair. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
So
Yep.
you're right, clearly it's always going to be the case, and so the gaps are very much playing a role here, but it's still coming down to the fact that something is amiss in terms of the budgetary allocation and the success of the education.
How do you get from being ranked 37 to becoming a leader in high tech?
Right. So here, can I hold that for a second?
Yes.
And I'll come back to that.
Yes.
Richard, what was your question? Because I want to move on to the economy.
I just have to make a comment. They test for literacy.
I expected such.
No.
They test
I
for,
love you, Richard.
I'm sorry.
Don't apologize. I meant it.
They test for literacy, math, and science.
Yeah,
But art and music may have a value.
it does
just
have a
as
value.
much as Jewish wisdom that's not tested
Right.
has a value, or other functions.
Correct.
So my comment is maybe they're not testing for other values that are valuable.
Right. We would
to-
rock those art scores. You're totally right. I think you probably know that most comparative testing that happens around the world, even in America, very rarely looks at those subject matter, and I think that's not great. It's not a big enough picture. I totally agree with you. Couldn't agree with you more.
So Israel leads in the technical world, even
Right.
though it's lower in math and science. There
So that's
must
what I'm
be
gonna
other
address.
values that is taught or.
You're totally right. You're totally right. There are plenty of other values that we can lift up and that we might even be better than the rest of the world at. However, I think that certainly the folks who are in the industry and understand education and its role on impacting adulthood and the economics of it and whatever, know that literacy, math, and science are core components, and so that's what they focus on. It doesn't mean it's the whole picture.
But not everybody's an engineer.
You're right. You're totally right. You're totally right. So let's. We're going to go backwards and take a look at Israel's economy, and then I'll be able to answer Shelley's question on sort of the high tech sector. So obviously, we are technically in the middle of the war. According to Netanyahu's statement yesterday, we might actually be back at war any minute now. I don't know if anybody's watching the news. But there's currently a breakdown over Israel's demand to continue the first stage of the ceasefire, Hamas's demand to move on, as was previously agreed, to the second stage of the ceasefire. And so Israel, as of this morning, stopped the entrance of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip and has declared that it reserves the right to go back and fight in order to convince Hamas to release more of the hostages as part of the first stage, meaning not moving on to the second stage, which would require Israeli troops to withdraw from the Gaza Strip and end the war. Again, we're not going to focus on that. That's not a domestic issue. But obviously the war over the last year and a half has had a tremendous impact on Israel's economy. What is remarkable is that much of that impact was felt early on. Since then, Israel's economy has rebounded in ways that nobody expected, which has been a pretty good thing. It's quite stable. So, a few facts just to throw out at you. Our national budget is about 180 billion US dollars compared to 7 trillion in the US. Obviously, we're a smaller country. 60 billion of that, 17% of that budget is aimed at military expenses. This is for the 2025 budget, should it actually pass. Right, compared to 14% in the US, which would mean that in 2025, if I'm not mistaken, Israel would be the leader in the entire world in devoting a percentage of a budget to military expenditures. I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing, right? Obviously, in a wartime, it might be a necessity. Clearly, that money that wasn't going towards military has got to come from somewhere. And so other sectors, other issues are going to suffer. And so most of the economists and the analysts who are sort of cheering at how Israel's economy has been relatively stable and rebounded quite well from the war are very, very nervous about the next year or two. Because the more that we're drawing money away from those other issues in order to deal with the realities during and following the war, clearly there's going to be some suffering, and we'll have to wait and see what effect that is. So that's a very, very serious concern. Sorry?
Wouldn't 60 billion be a third of the national budget?
Did I do that? Oh, sorry, I did that wrong. That's 60 billion shekels. Thank you. Woo! I won't correct that right now, but I want to remind me afterwards. I want to correct that. That is 60 billion shekels, 17% of our budget. Yeah, I did that. I know I did that because I wanted to do the first one in dollars so that you could compare it to America. The second one, we didn't really need to compare it to America because I was doing it in percentages, but I used the wrong symbol. Thank you for noticing. Yes, that is 60 billion shekels, which is 17%, I believe. Feel free to do the math of the national budget. Okay, our economy grew by 1% last year. How about that? Granted, we grew by 2% the year before and 6% the year before that, but still growing 1% in a time of war is pretty impressive. Not surprisingly, most of that was due to the government's investment in the military, right? Meaning we were buying and making a ton of shit in order to be able to do what the government had deemed necessary in terms of its military operations. So that was a large part of what was going on. And obviously much of that money and material is coming from the United States. So you all have a hand in that particular statistic. Once again, if we take that out of the equation, meaning as we move forward, perhaps beyond the war, although that still remains to be seen, the government is clearly not going to be investing as much. It will be emergency spending. And so the question is what will be the repercussions, right? Along with the money that we've already diverted away from other issues, now we're going to have less government spending, and we have some very, very serious challenges awaiting us. Like, for example, inflation, which is currently at 3.8%, much higher than yours. The economists don't expect that to change anytime soon. That is obviously a concern amongst your average Israeli citizens. The government, as of January 1st, increased our sales tax from 17 to 18%. How about that, New Hampshireites, with your no sales tax? We pay 18% sales tax. There are certain goods that have a much higher sales tax or an import fee. the most famous of which, of course, are vehicles, where we pay roughly 75 to 80% tax when we buy a car. So just to give you a sense that Israelis, because we are a first world country, but living kind of in a second world universe, most Israelis are outliving their financial needs, especially when we want to play with the big boys like Americans and have the same toys and the same vehicles and same technology, but we're earning roughly half the amount that we would earn in the same exact job in the Western world. So that is also going to play a bit of a disastrous role as we move forward, because societally speaking, we want to keep playing that game, right, living that lifestyle, but our income is going to keep dwindling because there's been a lot of lost jobs, there's been a lot of trauma in society. Obviously, there's a tremendous price to pay for having a war, even if you feel that the war was, just.
Does that sales tax include food?
Include food, everything.
Wow.
So when you go to the grocery store, you pay 18% sales tax on food, basically.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Actually, maybe now I should look that up. I'm pretty sure it's on everything. Yeah, but the good thing is, well, good thing, I don't know. In America, I know I keep getting confused because you go to the cash register and then it's a different price from what the tag says. In Israel, we do the sales price included. So when you buy the product, whatever you're buying, you see the price including the sales tax. And then when you get to the cashier, you don't have to do any math. It's already done for you. It's just that things are really friggin' expensive. Especially imports. And obviously, as much as we're pretty good at doing a lot at home, there are lots of things that we don't do. We tried making cars in the 1950s. That didn't turn out very well. So we import all of our vehicles, right? We import so much of our military infrastructure. We import, for some strange reason, most of our agriculture now, because the ingrown agriculture, we ship off to Europe because they pay more money for our food than we're willing to. So we then turn around and buy cheap stuff from the East. I mean, it's like a lot of economies. It doesn't make sense all the time, but nonetheless. Okay, housing costs are shooting up. It's crazy. We're in the middle of a war. Buildings are coming down, and yet it's impossible to afford a house. That is largely because of labor shortage. At the beginning of the war, most of our foreign workers, we have about 300,000 foreign workers every year in the state of Israel, they all went home because why would you want to stick around during a war? Most of our construction industry are Romanians and Chinese. And so if they're not around to build the homes, and Israelis are like, hell no, I'm not doing that. So then you have a labor shortage problem, right? Meaning you can't build houses fast enough to keep up. Immigration, we've seen a lot of Jewish communities, especially as part of this backlash to the war, right? Where there's rising anti-Semitism in Europe, you've seen increased Jewish immigration, which means more people need homes. It's a supply and demand issue. And then finally, foreign investment. There has never, ever, ever been a dip in wealthy Americans or French Jews who want to own a piece of the Holy Land. And we Israelis can't compete. So obviously, if you're a real estate contractor or whatever in Israel, you're going to build for the highest bidder, right? Now we have some laws in place that prevent that, or at least try to equalize the game. So if you're going to build a fancy schmancy apartment for an American Jew who shows up 3 weeks a year, you also have to build sort of a low-key building for local Israelis who need a home for their kids. But nonetheless, if foreign investment keeps going up all the time, that is clearly going to be a distraction from building for people who just live in Israel and can't afford it.
Jared, can I answer the question about the grocery tax?
Yes. Did you look it up?
I just looked it up. Yep. Fruits and vegetables are not subject to that. Everything else is.
Bingo. Look at that. We got Google on hand. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Fruits and vegetables
If you
not
like
subject
that, come to the
VAT.
board meetings.
Right, exactly. Do you Google everybody at board meetings?
Pretty much.
Okay, so that's why nobody comes. Just kidding. All right, so just to give you a sense, before the war, Tel Aviv was the 8th most expensive city in the world. That is largely because of housing costs. If we go back about 3 or 4 years, they were actually the #1 most expensive city in the world, believe it or not. Jerusalem has also ranked up pretty high. Now it's fallen a little bit, but it gives you the sense that, here we are, this teeny tiny little country in the Middle East, and yet we are sort of spending beyond belief. But now, as a result of the war, we're going to have some very, very serious income issues. Tourism, I know some of you are very interested in this, so I thought I'd put this on there. We had 1 million tourists last year compared to 4.5 right before Corona. That was our peak year, that was the record. We have a long way to go to get back to that, and it's not coming around anytime soon. In terms of income, about $1.5 billion from tourism last year compared to 18 billion in 2019. Granted, tourism in Israel is roughly 6% of the GDP, so it's not rocking the boat. Obviously, for people who are involved in tourism, it sucks. But it is a significant part of the labor force because it kind of reaches its tentacles into almost every arena, right? If you're a restaurateur, if you work in a hotel, literally everything. You could work at a national park. You're all kind of connected to tourism. And obviously, it's not about the money, right? Israel's kind of narrative, our identity is largely based on the fact that we are the Holy Land and that the world wants to and should be able to come, connect to their roots and tell their stories and see their prophets and, right? Whatever people do in the Holy Land, we kind of want that reputation. And so if we're not getting the money coming in, that sucks, but it's much worse than Israel having a reputation of being a place that nobody wants to go to anymore. That's going to have a very serious, much longer term effect, obviously, on the economy. Did I have another one? Oh, I did, yes, here's the answer, Shelley, pay attention.
Point that out, Jared.
High tech accounts for about 18% of GDP, 14% of our labor force, 25% of our national tax income. So that is a tremendously important part of our economic sector. Again, in the early stages of the war, you might have heard there were lots of folks who were pulling out their money because they were afraid of volatility in the markets. There were a number of high-tech leaders and well-known figures in Israel that decided to relocate either their business or their money to countries outside of Israel. That lasted probably only for about 6 months, and then things started to return, even while the war was raging on. And right now, actually, as of the last quarter, Israeli high-tech has brought in a stunning amount of investment, even though things are not terribly stable, meaning there's a tremendous amount of faith in the high-tech industry. So to answer Shelley's question, I didn't answer that. How is it that this is so significant and so successful when the education situation is kind of shit? And so what essentially happens is that, and this is well documented if you've ever read Startup Nation, that most of the preparation for Israelis who are going to end up in this field is happening in the military. It's not necessarily happening in the school system. Obviously, math and science and everything else, Richard, matters. But what's key is that when you get into the military, for many people, it's kind of like starting over. Whatever you've learned, great, but now we're going to teach you everything you need to know. And so much of that is high tech because Israel has one of the most advanced militaries in the world. And so as a result of that, right, you have a tremendous amount of folks who are coming out of the military, whether they're serving 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, it doesn't really matter. And they have gained so much knowledge and skills that they become essentially key assets to the high-tech community, even if they sucked at math or even if they failed out of school. It almost doesn't matter because of your military experience. And obviously it's not exclusive, but it is something to sort of pay attention to. And so hopefully that's a plus, meaning we'll be able to sustain Israel's high-tech industry, even if we're not doing great in education, but clearly eventually the shit's gonna hit the fan, right? If kids can't do math, then when they get to the military, they're gonna struggle to be able to operate high-tech and to code and to do whatever they need to do in that world. Rich?
The 60 is not the right number, but the 17%.
Which one?
The second line.
Yeah.
But that's okay.
That's not right?
No, but the 17%.
Why isn't it right? I want to
It was
know.
180 billion.
Yeah,
we already
No, this is shekels.
Yeah, but 60 billion shekels doesn't work, but that's not the
Okay,
point.
we'll get to that after.
So, yeah, I mean.
I apologize.
That's okay,
I'll check my sources.
The 17% is pretty close.
Okay.
But I think the US is sending something like, we are sending something like $18 billion worth of military aid to Israel. So is that like?
Right now, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's an extra amount that's coming now, but it's 3.8 billion a year.
3.8 billion is
3.8
US,
billion in U.S. military aid every year,
which would be on top of that, right?
which would
Like,
be,
that, whatever the right number is, you're not including the aid that comes from US.
right, correct. As
Yeah,
far
yeah,
as I
yeah.
know, that is not included.
Okay, and right now I think it's a lot more than 3 point whatever.
Yeah, because,
Yeah.
well, the Trump administration is sort of, like, there's a special clause now that there, I don't know exactly what the numbers were, but I remember reading about that.
Well, there's a difference between what they gift, 3.8 billion, but Israel buys more, but uses its own money to do it.
Right, meaning most of the 3.8 billion that we get every year isn't actually cash. It's simply sort of like a voucher that we use in buying American military products.
But what I'm saying is Israel might buy another 10 billion.
Right,
and it
from
uses
its own money, correct.
Yeah.
And that's part of the military expenditure.
Just going back to the high tech, so once you leave the army and if you go to universities and in the universities and you're studying high tech, where do the Israeli universities fit in regards to the rest of the world in their high tech department?
Yeah,
It's not just the army that they're.
that is true, that is true. Army is usually where it starts. Again,
Right.
for Jews, because you're going to the military before university, in case anybody wasn't aware of that. Just to be very clear, from high school you go to the military or to civil service if you don't fit that mold, and then you go to university. So the universities generally are quite highly ranked in the world. We only have 5 of them, so there's not a lot of options, but they generally are quite highly respected. They do quite well. They are highly subsidized if you are an Israeli citizen. It is often sort of the ultimate equalizer between Jewish and non-Jewish society because that's the first time that many of these people actually meet. And as citizens, they all have equal access. So there's a lot to be said for good for Israeli universities. But oftentimes, especially in the high-tech industry, they're working off of the knowledge and the skills that you're gaining in the military, certainly for the Jewish sector.
Yeah.
So they're building on that, not necessarily on what might be a flawed public school education system. Yeah. Okay. One other fact that I just wanted to throw out to you, largely because it affects me personally, and that is that every year in Israel, we see about 60,000 new businesses open up. And for the first time in the last couple of years, we are starting to see higher and higher numbers of those businesses shut down. Not surprisingly, really, because of the demands on society at large. What is quite fascinating, I think this is one of the higher numbers in the world, more than 50% of businesses in Israel have one worker. Right? Meaning we are a culture of very independent sort of freelance people. Hello. And so what often happens is that if you get a call-up notice, right, or somebody in your family is injured, you don't have employees to rely on. And so while the numbers may not add up super fast, because obviously if you only have one employee, it's just one, but nonetheless, it tends to sort of, the effect spreads much faster, right? When you have a world that you live in where kind of everybody's sort of doing their own thing. It's actually something that I think a lot of Israelis embrace. There's that kind of independent spirit that I'm just going to start my own thing, I'm going to do my own thing, and I'm going to be great. And generally, it's quite successful. But this is a period of time that we have seen things happen that have not happened before in Israel. And so that's going to be very interesting to watch. We don't know what's going to happen yet, but it is certainly going to be interesting to watch because many of those businesses simply cannot survive if you, as the only employee, are busy doing something else, war-related or just suffering from the general reality over the last couple of years. So just something to sort of think about. I don't actually know the number in America. Mr. Google over there can check it out for us if he wants. What percentages of businesses in America have one employee? So let's see, where do we want to go? Oh yes, we have one more topic to discuss, and then if we have time, I'm happy to open it up for conversation. but this is actually one that I thought would be quite interesting, because a lot of people don't know about it, and also Kaya really wanted me to talk about it for reasons you will soon understand, and that is the World Zionist Congress. Does anybody know about the World Zionist Congress? 1, 2, 3. Okay, a few. All right, that's good. Well, now you're going to learn, because that's really important. Did you get a figure?
Roughly 6 million small businesses, 49% have just 1 to 4 workers.
Just 1 to 4 workers?
1 to 4.
All right, so if it was just 1, my guess is that number would be a little bit lower. All right, so Israel's maybe not so out of whack. I thought it was quite a shocking number. I didn't realize that half of Israeli businesses had just 1 worker. Anyways, okay, so the World Zionist Congress, you might remember from when we did the Zionist history, was founded in 1897. Theodor Herzl, Basel, Switzerland. It was part of the whole kind of push to, quote unquote, solve the Jewish problem, right? To sort of bring together all the leaders and the thinkers and the philanthropists and figure out how do we react to the fact that Jews are suffering and the persecution and the killings and the laws being passed. And so obviously that is where where Zionism was formally sort of declared and moved forward, all of its different streams. Obviously we talked about that nonetheless. The World Zionist Congress, since its founding, oversees the largest Jewish institutions in the world, which include the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish Agency, Kakal JNF, and Kevin Hayesod. You might be familiar with some of those. The WZO, as we're going to explain, is largely about sort of budgets, allocating budgets, administration of the Jewish world. The Jewish Agency, primarily immigration to Israel and education, supporting immigrant communities and a number of other smaller projects. Kakal JNF, predominantly about land administration. The JNF controls about 13% of land in the state of Israel, which is tremendous as a sort of quasi-governmental institution. And they make some very critical decisions about what can happen on that land, right? Who's allowed to live there? Who's allowed to build there? Is it forest land? Is it developing land, etc.? And then Kevin Hayesod sort of plays into a number of those other categories. So these are the 4 largest institutions in the Jewish world. They are overseen by the World Zionist Congress. The World Zionist Congress has an annual budget of more than $1 billion. And that $1 billion is administered on an annual basis by these 525 members of the Congress, 200 from Israel, 152 from the United States, and 173 from the rest of the diaspora. The 200 delegates from Israel are all appointed according to Israeli elections, governmental elections. Meaning that I don't vote for my World Zionist Congress representatives, I simply vote at my elections, and then the representation is broken down by how the elections play out, right? So the certain slates, based on their political representation, get certain numbers of delegates into the World Zionist Congress. However, the United States obviously can't do that. So how do you get delegates in the United States? You have to vote for them.
You vote, right.
And that's why we're talking about this, because this is a very, very big domestic issue in Israel that you can actually play a role in, which is kind of cool, but also quite surprising that most Jews in America don't even know about, don't seem to give a shit about. We need to change that. Fern.
So where does the $1 billion budget come from?
From everywhere, meaning part of it is from the Israeli government, part of it is from federations that raise money and sort of devote a certain part of that to the World Zionist Congress. Some of it is philanthropy, right? Any source you can possibly imagine, it happens. And in terms of, since we're talking about budget, in terms of what it goes to, literally any issue you can think of that connects to the Jewish people, the World Zionist Congress debates it. I mean, literally anything. Things that you would sort of seem as kind of obvious, right? Like funding Jewish activities, to things that you might never even think of. And all across the political spectrum, you name it, everything is talked about. Meaning any issue that you might care about, you can be guaranteed that by being active in the World Zionist Congress, you'll have a say about that. There are elections every 5 years. This year, you can vote at azm.org, starting March 10th, going to May 4th. And yes, this is a push to get you involved because it's responsible and it has a lot to do with my life in Israel. So I would like to see as many people participate as possible because that's how democracy works. Every U.S. Jewish adult is eligible to vote unless you are also an Israeli citizen and voted in the last elections, because technically that was voting for the World Zionist Congress on Israel's part. And you have to pay a $5 fee, which I don't think is that much to ask, covers all of their operation costs. I don't even know how that works because I'm not allowed to vote, so you have to go to azm.org, and I assume you can just put it on a credit card or something, but whatever. Only 124,000 Jews voted in 2020 in the U.S. How many Jews are in America?
Too many.
Yeah. You got at least 5.5 million. Some say upwards of 6.5 million, right? 124,000 Jews participated in the election. That is not a lot. So obviously, Temple Israel is not going to radically change that number, but I think it's really, really important to sort of, if you feel anything about Israel, and clearly you do because you've been listening to me for the last 6 months, I feel like you should say your piece, right? And the easiest way to do that is simply to go online and look at the 21 slates of electors that are run. It's kind of like an Israeli election, right? Too many things to choose from. And that's up from 13 in the last elections. Each slate is usually a kind of a coalition of different Jewish communities or movements, some representing kind of denominational Judaism, right, like the Reform and Conservative world or the Orthodox world. Some of them are about politics, some of them are about social issues. You just got to do a little bit of reading and figure out where you fit in and do the vote.
It's a mini Israeli election.
Sorry?
It's like a mini.
It's like a mini Israeli election. Yeah, it's sort of, you can sort of have fun with it. Read up on them. Look, I can guarantee you that when you go to the slate, you'll see 10 names that you can immediately say, nope, there's no way in hell I'm going to vote for them. So you don't have to read their slates and then just focus on the 10 that you feel like you identify with, right? It's kind of like any election in that sense. Each slate, this is kind of fascinating, must be at least 40% women. Why couldn't they have put 50? I don't know. And 25% of the electors must be under the age of 35, right? Which is kind of nice. And finally, the 39th Congress will convene in Jerusalem on October 28th and 30th. So obviously, once these elections happen, now here's the catch, and this is one of the reasons why I brought it up. In the last elections in 2020, there was a rather surprising shift in how the elections played out. Largely because, traditionally speaking, the ultra-Orthodox world has not really participated because of one simple reason: the word Zionist. Not all the ultra-Orthodox parties are comfortable with that term. Not because they don't love being Jewish or they don't love Israel, but because Zionism is kind of a concept that they're still working around, right? Especially as it relates to the modern political identity of the State of Israel and the relationship between that and the ultra-Orthodox community. However, in 2020, they realized, just like they did in the 1980s when they decided we're going to start running for the Israeli Knesset, and they did super well. So here they also finally realized, if we're not playing the game, we're not calling the shots. And so for the first time, there were a number of ultra-Orthodox representatives who ran a slate in the World Zionist Congress. They were tremendously successful, once again, for the same reason that the political parties in Israel are successful. Very high voting rates, right? If the rabbi says, you do. And so they were able to kind of garnish a tremendous amount of World Zionist Congress. Not that that's a bad thing, but I'm guessing they might have different priorities than, let's say, folks at Temple Israel. And so all of a sudden, and completely out of the blue, what had been, not surprisingly, a dominant force of very liberal, somewhat secular Judaism in America, represented in the powers that be that are allocating $1 billion every year, all of a sudden now swung the other way. And priorities were reorganized. And you know what? Kudos to them. They did it well. So now, if you care about certain issues in Israel, and you have a certain sensibility that puts you in this community, which is obviously going to differentiate you from other communities, you may want to get involved. Because if all the other communities that you might not fully agree with on Judaism or Israel or politics or education, they're going to do it, and you're not, you can't really complain, right, when you look at Israel. So one big issue, for example, that I'll just bring up is that the JNF and Kakal, part of the land issues that they deal with also include the communities in the West Bank, right? What some of you might refer to as the settlements. So clearly, if you're going to swing the electorate to the more conservative, to the more pro-settlement issue, to the more pro, Judea-Samaria issue, that's going to have a tremendous play than if the typical, again, not everybody, but the typical American voice, which probably wouldn't necessarily vote that way if they were to have more influence. That's just one example of many in terms of how things play out. So whether you support the settlements, you don't support the settlements, right? That's just one of many examples of how getting involved is going to clearly have an effect. It's $1 billion going to the 4 largest Jewish organizations in the world, directing their activities. So that's how you have an influence. And so I wanted to make sure to do that because Kaya, I think, is going to start a campaign, at least that's what she told me, and she would like to educate the community as much as possible. So now you can be ambassadors and talk about how this is so simple and yet can have a tremendous effect, especially if you love Israel and want to have your say.
I was just wondering why I'd never heard of this.
Because the American Zionist movement, which is responsible for the American elections, generally sucks at PR. They have not done a fantastic job. They have tried. I don't want to completely condemn them, but every year since this whole thing started has been relatively weak in terms of the percentage of American Jews that participate in this process. They do expect, because of a tremendous investment in PR, although clearly it hasn't reached Portsmouth, New Hampshire, but they do expect that this number is going to climb exponentially this year. We'll see if that happens. But they have started to sort of publicize on social media. They have lots of ambassadors that are sort of talking about the elections. So I'm hoping that you might hear it from other voices than just me, but hopefully it will spread a little bit better and more people will get involved. Because literally the whole reason it exists is for you to be able to participate. Otherwise, we would just make all the decisions ourselves in Israel.
You may not know this, but if I go online and pay the $5, how do they know I'm Jewish? What stops American evangelicals from voting?
Funny that you mentioned that. There's already been a crisis. So first of all, to answer your question, you have to sign, it's mostly built on trust. You have to sign a document that says, I am a Jew, I am not a member of another religion, and I support what's called the Jerusalem program, which is sort of the inheritor of what was called the Basel program in the original World Zionist Congress. It's basically like a statement of Zionist principles. You may actually not agree with 100% of them, but obviously you have to check the box if you want to vote. The point is that you sign saying this is who I am, but it was one of the new parties, right? Remember, they're sort of doubling the number of parties this year. One of the new parties that joined up turns out that they are funded by sort of an evangelical lobby that has tremendous interests in what happens in Israel. They're not doing anything illegal because the people in the party are Jewish, and they are voting as Jews and they signed the documents, so there's nothing really that can be done to stop them. But it kind of became a mini scandal because there was some concern that this sort of beyond the Jewish world was also having a say, which maybe should be even more of an impetus for you to get off your asses and vote, because apparently lots of folks are getting involved in this game and you want to have your say. So I don't know what will happen. I think that the crisis kind of involved because they apparently unwittingly involved David Friedman, the former ambassador to Israel, to be like, a figure on their slate. He has since withdrawn because he didn't realize it was going to cause a scandal. Even though he has tremendous relationships with those evangelical communities, largely because of their support of the Jewish communities in Judea and Samaria. That's his political path. But it caused enough of a splash that he said, no, I'm not involved anymore. It's there's all, literally the slates represent everybody. You will find your identity among those parties, I guarantee you.
Do those 4 organizations manage things only in Israel or all over the world?
Well, it's connected to the world, but they're really on the ground mostly in Israel, right? Meaning the Jewish Agency is all about kind of connection with the diaspora, but it largely in relation to either making Aliyah or education about Israel. So everything's kind of Israel-based, but oftentimes lots of far-reaching activities that take place. The Jewish Agency also sends shlichim, right, the emissaries, to Jewish communities, let's say in the former Soviet Union, to be able to educate about Israel, about Judaism, and then maybe help people to make Aliyah, especially in areas of the world where being Jewish is hard or problematic. There's definitely things that happen around the world, but it is very much Israel-centric.
What's the process for qualifying as a slate of electors?
Well, it's too late for that, if you were interested. It's actually,
I'm interested.
yeah, it's very, very easy. And it's all at azm.org. If you go online, you'll see. I mean, now the page might be closed, but you should still be able to read it. It's actually not that complicated. I don't even think it really costs that much. Although I would certainly warn folks from, starting too many parties, because obviously that's a problem. One of the things, I should mention this, especially because at least as a community, right? Clearly, at least I assume you're not aligned with the ultra-Orthodox world. That is that there, because of this kind of opening of the floodgates, right, of slates to run, there is some concern that among that section of world Jewry, there's going to be more competition, and therefore they may not be as successful as if they had kind of bonded together. You can always make that argument about the other side of the spectrum, because that side has always been divided. But now it's sort of more equally divided on sort of all sides of the Jewish identity spectrum. We only have a couple minutes left, so I just wanted to end on one up note, and that is that despite everything that is going on, remarkably, the happiest countries of the world still consist of Finland, Denmark, Iceland, Sweden, and number 5, Israel! Woo! Guess where you all are? Number 23. Happy freaks. I am happy to stick around and chat with people a little bit if you would like. I only have about 10-15 minutes and I have to run to teach in another city. But it has been an absolute joy to learn with you, and I just want to thank you for being so welcoming and so enthusiastic. I can't promise when I might be back, but obviously if I am, largely because this guy lives down the street, I will always end up in this area, and I will reach out to the community, and I would love to come say hi and do more teaching. So you'll know when I'm back in town. Otherwise, feel free to come visit me in Jerusalem. We need some tourism numbers.
Before Jared takes off, on behalf of our community, we just wanted to give him a little send-off from our children, from us, and from Rebecca, who baked cookies.
Oh, no way.
Because no Jew should ever go hungry.
No.
Thank you so much, absolutely. And I would not be remiss in saying that while we are very lucky to have a connection like Jared, programs like this are directly funded from our endowment funds and from our donation funds. So thank all of you who have given and donated, and please continue and encourage other members to do so we can continue having programs like Jared. Thank you all for coming.